Well, thank you. I am actually optimistic, and I have to say that's despite the fact that the game I was involved with just now, I left after 6 turns. But within those 6 turns, all the whales had already died, malaria had spread, the unions had struck, there had been civil war, there were rabid pandas running down the street. It was all just a complete mess. Yet, nonetheless, I'm not going to talk too much about the environment, and I do think it's a very serious issue. But I am going to focus on the environment, on global progress. I also can smell that I am between you and dinner, so I'll try and be quite quick. It smells lovely. As good a place to start as any with what development economists have to say about who's rich and who's poor, who has lives and who has lives of plenty and who has lives of misery, is this guy. His name is Mungo Park. He was a Scottish doctor who had a real case of the wanderlust. In 1794, about 20 years after Adam Smith had written his great text on economic development, The Wealth of Nations, Mungo here set off to find the city of Timbuktu, which at the time sort of in the West was sort of considered semi-legendary. Nobody really knew where it was. Although in fact, this map from 1798 actually has Timbuktu placed pretty much accurately. And the reason it's surprising that 4 years after Mungo Park had set off to find Timbuktu in 1798 we had a good idea of where it was is because actually Mungo Park didn't make it to Timbuktu. He spent 2 years trying, he got a bad case of malaria, he was imprisoned for a while and gave up. But not a man to surrender so easily. 10 years later he tried again. And he tried again with 41 European troops, an artist, his brother-in-law, who came along for the trip, and a score of local porters. In 1805, they set off from Gambia. They met with terrible weather. They met with wild dogs. They met with crocodiles. They met with packs of lions. But what really did for them was dysentery and malaria and other maladies nowadays we call neglected tropical diseases. A few months after they'd set off, they did actually reach the Niger River at Sego, 500 miles inland. By that point, 500 miles inland, 12 of the 43 Europeans on the trip were still alive. As they went down the river, more and more of them died. Park's last known letter back home said, "Party reduced to 3 soldiers, 1 deranged in his mind, Lieutenant Martin and myself." They did actually make it to Timbuktu. However, the Tuareg weren't too pleased to see them, and Park and Martin, the last 2 left alive at that point, were ambushed at the rapids of Busa, 300 miles short of the sea. They threw themselves overboard and were never seen again. But apart from those 2, 41 of the 43 Europeans on the trip were killed not by violence, but by disease. Contrast that story to these 2. Captain Meriwether Lewis and Mr. William Clark, famed for their adventure across North America when the United States bought Louisiana and much else from the French because the French were busy fighting a lot of wars with the British. Lewis and Clark were told to go and survey what had been bought. It's hard to tell, but over there is on top, your top right, is Lake Superior. Over here is just the very end of the Pacific Ocean. They went all the way across North America. They actually set off 2 years before Mungo Park and arrived back in the east of the United States after his death. They set up diplomatic relations with 24 indigenous nations. They traversed the Rockies. They went up and down the Columbia River. Clark's journal reports that several men did have a dysentery, and 2/3 of them with ulcers and boils. Nonetheless, of the 33 men on the expedition, only 1 died, and he died of a case of appendicitis. Now, why have I spent all this time, 5 minutes, at a session on poverty and plenty, talking about 2-century-old history? Because if you read the economic journals nowadays, the different fates of Mr. Park and Mr. Meriwether and Mr. Lewis tell you pretty much all you need to know about global wealth and global poverty, global excess and global misery. To simplify a little, the model looks like this. 12 years ago, great economists all based in Boston, Darren Ashimoglu and Simon Johnson and James Robinson, argue pretty much that colonies like the ones that followed in the footsteps of Mungo Park, colonies which were a serious health hazard to European adventurers, lent themselves to smash and grab tactics. Basically, very few colonists would go to these places, and knowing that they were likely to die very quickly, they tried to extract as much as quickly as possible before running back home, before they died. Actually, most of them failed to get back home before they died. But that was the model. And that meant all the institutions that they created were set up in order to extract wealth. They left behind colonies that were, and finally independent countries that were incredibly unequal and had almost nothing in the way of a provision of public goods. Conversely, places where colonists could survive without succumbing to a range of tropical diseases had a rather different outcome. Ashimoglu and Johnson don't really go into this part of the story in great depth, but one of the reasons they had a different outcome was because a whole bunch of Europeans went and pretty much wiped out the natives, wiped out the indigenous populations. North America, a classic example. Now, in those places, you ended up with colonies with reasonably equitable institutions, because there was a bunch of Europeans who were left who planned to live there. So that meant things like constitutions and laws that favored inclusion and participation, structures of government that encouraged high-quality provision of public services like schools and infrastructure and health. And those countries ended up very rich. Actually, if you read the economics journals, it's not just that colonial history matters. It's actually also pre-colonial history. This is a picture of the slave bark Wildfire. And in a recent American Economic Review article, a great economist called Nathan Nunn went back and looked at where slaves came from in Africa. And he said that countries in Africa that were more pillaged for slaves back 300 years ago were poorer today and had weaker institutions and poorer outcomes. That was not good enough for Bill Easterly and his colleagues. In 2010, he wrote a paper saying, 300 years of history, nothing. His paper was called, Was the Wealth of Nations Determined in 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago, by factors such as who had writing and the iron tools and the wheel at the time. If your ancestors came from a place that had writing and the wheel in 1000 BC, you probably live in a rich country today. If your ancestors didn't come from a place like that, your ancestors are probably poor and dying young and ill-educated today. Now, I don't know how many of you have read Jared Diamond's book about global development. He, of course, would say, 3,000 years. 3,000 years is nothing. Mere millennia. It goes back to Pangaea breaking up into different continents. Basically, if your ancestors came from a continent that was wide but reasonably squat, you're rich today. If you came from a continent that is tall and narrow, you're in trouble. I am simplifying, but only a little bit. And in fact, sadly, there is something to these stories of the determinants of modern wealth and poverty, modern excess and modern lack, really dating back a long time. Really, there's some evidence for it. Liberia, around here on the map, has an income about the same as Gaul had at the time of Caesar, according to the great lamented University of Groningen scholar down the road, Angus Maddison. Democratic Republic of Congo, which occupies the space at the bottom of the map, is actually slightly poorer. Actually, all 12 of the poorest countries in the world and 19 out of the poorest 20 are in Africa. And there's been huge divergence in income worldwide over the last 200 years. Some countries the Netherlands, have got very, very rich. Other countries have stayed pretty much as poor as they've ever been. But this is a really depressing story, right? What matters is the structure of the kind of institutions you have. Do you have inclusive institutions that provide a lot of public goods like education and health and infrastructure, or not? What determines what kind of institutions you have is history going back 5,000 years. Countries on the wrong side of this historical divide are destined to poverty and ill health and illiteracy and civil unrest and dictatorships and general misery and wishing they had the problems of excess. Liberia will remain Liberia forever. Good news here is that it can't be the whole story, and we know that partially because when you look at the world at night, that's what North Korea looks like and that's what South Korea looks like. North Korea and South Korea were the same country for most of the last 1,000 years. They have a similar history, a similar institutional history over the long term. Of course, they haven't had a similar institutional history over the last 60 or 70 years. North Korea remains one of the very, very poorest places on the planet. That's why they don't have very many lights there. South Korea is one of the great development successes of all time. It's a member of the Rich Country Club of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And actually, the income picture gets a bit more positive than that, because actually in the last 10 years, 6 out of 10 of the fastest growing countries in the world actually are on the continent of Africa. Even Liberia is actually doing a bit better. But although there is more good news about income, the big news about income is bad news. It's of this huge divergence. But the good news is that money isn't everything. Because worldwide, everywhere is seeing massive improvements in the quality of life. Back in the day, this is a picture from down the road, the sick child. Anyway, everywhere worldwide, a few centuries ago, health was very poor, and child health in particular was terrible. Countries rich and poor, and the Netherlands at the time of this picture was one of the richest, if not the richest country in the world, was seeing about 1/3 of children dying in infancy. Child mortality, infant mortality started dropping in the 19th century. 1950, the global figure was 15% of kids dying in infancy. Today, that figure is closer to 4.3%. The global figure is closer to 4.3%. Huge global progress, 4/5 decline worldwide in infant mortality. And the rate really is dropping everywhere. And actually, in the last few years, we've seen particularly heartening progress in Africa. Senegal has cut its child mortality rate, that's kids younger than the age of 5, dying. It's cut that rate from 12% to 7% in just 5 years. Brilliant. And it's not just a story of education. It's not just a story of health, it's also a story of education. Now, again, the Netherlands was a world leader in spreading out access to education. This is Steen, the village school. It's actually now owned by the National Gallery in Scotland. But anyway, this is a Dutch school. You can tell, high quality education, everything working wonderfully. At least, the Netherlands really was a world leader, not just in education, but also in literacy. But it's not just the Netherlands anymore. Between 1950 and 1999, global literacy climbed from about 50% of the world population to about 80%. Primary school enrollments in Africa today are nudging towards 100%. Pretty much every kid of primary age in Africa is going to school. Pretty much. That is not completely true, but most of them. And it's not just education. This is a picture of Tahrir Square in Cairo. The Arab Spring, for all that we know it hasn't been a perfect success, is the latest sign of a massive global spread of democracy. The measures we have of democracy, and all of them are imperfect and ideological, but anyway, the measures we have of democracy, all of them, suggest that pretty much we're at an all-time global high at the percentage of the world population that lives in something that can plausibly be called a democracy. And war. The number of wars going on worldwide fell from 24 in 1984 to 5 in 2008. I could go on, but rates of murder are down worldwide as well. And really, Number of people saying they're happy is at the highest ever. Anyway, really, the quality of life improvement is a global phenomenon, and it's a really positive global phenomenon in that the places that were furthest behind, that had the highest child mortality, the lowest life expectancy, the lowest literacy, the lowest primary education rates, the highest rates of violence, are seeing the fastest progress towards a better quality of life. So we're seeing convergence in global quality of life compared to this massive divergence in income. And it's even true of countries that are not only desperately poor, but getting poorer. Niger, about here on Mungo Park's picture, in 2005, Niger, which was poor in 1960, was half as poor in 1960 in 2005. Average incomes in Niger dropped nearly by half, from nothing to half of nothing, between 1960 and 2005. It's hard to imagine Niger could be much poorer than it was in 2005, because already the average person was spending 85–90% of their incomes on just basic nutrition to stay alive. So you just can't get much poorer than Niger in 2005. And as I say, half as poor as it was in 1960. But there's been progress even in Niger. This is a picture of my daughter, Alex, my oldest daughter. She was about 6 months when this was taken. She's now 4, and she is still healthy and happy. Well, she's sneezing at this particular moment, but she's basically healthy and happy. This is 794 Alexes. It is the number of kids born in Niger last week, who will survive to their first birthday because of improvements in child health in that country since 1960. This is the yearly total. 42,400 Alexes. In one country, Niger, this country that has gone backwards in terms of income from nothing to less than nothing. Population of 14 million, small country in Africa. 42,000 Alexes will survive to celebrate their first birthday, who would have died if infant mortality rates were what they were in Niger in 1960. The level of infant mortality in Niger is still disgustingly, horribly high. It's still nearly 15% of kids die before the age of 1. But anyone who doesn't think that 40,000 infants a year surviving to their first birthday isn't progress is inhuman. The global figure is 220 times that. Every year, over 9 million kids survive to their first birthday who would have died if infant mortality rates were what they were globally at 1960. And Niger isn't like this odd exception that just happened to get health right when, it was getting poorer. The World Bank lists 12 countries whose incomes fell over the 1960 to 2005 period. They fell across those 12 countries on average by 27%. Over that same period, on average across those countries, life expectancy increased by 10 years. Over that same period, adult illiteracy rates halved. And for the 9 countries that we have kind of data on the quality of democracy, those scores increased in 7 out of 9. More broadly, there's a wonderful paper by Bill Easterly called Life During Growth. And it basically goes through a raft of measures of the quality of life and says, can we see any link with income growth and improvements in these measures of quality of life? His answer is no, we can't, across nearly all of them. There is, sadly, one exception, which is more income leads to more pollution. Although I have to say there's even some good news here, despite what we heard earlier on today. The good news is that the amount of pollution associated with producing $1 of GDP worldwide is a lot lower today than it was in 1960. The rate we're improving that is not fast enough, but it is a sign that we can make progress on this. I'm slightly more hopeful, perhaps, than others that we'll actually solve that problem. And in fact, there is some good news associated with pollution, if you will. And here's why. This is a picture of Afghanistan I took. It's a policeman directing traffic, and by golly, the traffic in Kabul is a wreck. But there's a good sign associated with that, which is the technology of the internal combustion engine has definitely made it to Kabul. And it's not just the technology of the internal combustion engine that has made it to Afghanistan. 60% odd of the population own a mobile phone, along with about 5 or 6 billion other people worldwide. That technology is spread incredibly fast. Plastic sheeting, steel nails and wire, matches, soap, chlorine. There are a whole bunch of technologies that have spread worldwide, even to the poorest communities. And I think this is the first of two factors that help explain why, despite the fact that income is diverging and some places are as poor as they've ever been, we've still seen quality of life improvement everywhere. It's new technologies. Here's a simple example. Picture of, I'm glad this is before dinner. This is a picture of somebody with smallpox. Not a nice disease. 300 to 500 million people with smallpox in the last century. This century, nobody will die of smallpox because we wiped it out. This is how. An incredibly simple vaccine. The total cost of a smallpox eradication program worldwide was about $312 million in today's money. In the usual metric of these things, that's about the same as a wing of a B-2 bomber. One wing, one B-2 bomber, 300 to 500 million fewer deaths. I spent a little bit of time earlier on this afternoon in the Museum of History and Science down the road. History of Science down the road. It's brilliant. I love it. One of the exhibitions they have there is of an iron lung. Now, an iron lung is what you use to take people who had polio, and their lungs had weakened so much that the only way they could breathe was basically being put in an iron box with only their head outside it. And the air pressure in the iron box was reduced and increased, and that artificially inflated their lungs and contracted their lungs. It was the only way they could breathe, they could stay alive. Polio is a disease that affected millions and millions of people every year, only a few decades ago. Last year, we were down to 200 or 300 cases. We're on the cusp of wiping out a second major life-destroying disease worldwide. Again, because of a vaccination. There are other things that soap is just a great technology. Go use soap. But it gets but soap gets to another side of the problem. Soap really has spread worldwide, but as you probably are aware, people don't always wash their hands when they should. This is about more than technology. The second major factor that allows improved outcomes in the quality of life, even at the same income, is the spread of new norms of behavior, new ideas about what should be normal. And washing your hands is something that was completely abnormal for the vast majority of human history. But now, worldwide, people accept that after you go to the bathroom, it is kind of a good idea to do it. Again, even if they don't always do it, they at least know it's a good idea. Other norms have changed. The idea that it was right to vaccinate your kids is still actually not completely believed in large parts of Europe and the United States, I'm embarrassed to say. It is increasingly accepted in the developing world that, of course, if the vaccine camp is set up near your village, you take your kids and you get them vaccinated. And that has just had a huge impact. The number of measles deaths over the last 10 years worldwide has dropped by nearly 3/4. It's just brilliant. But it's more than just having the vaccine. It's getting the parents making the decision to go. In fact, there's data from household surveys worldwide that suggest that if you could just get parents to follow sort of best practice parenting in a few simple health areas, so what to do when your kid has diarrhea, and when to seek treatment, just that alone, just sort of those two things would reduce the number of child deaths by a third overnight. And if you kind of keep on adding that up, we'll get to a world where there is a lot fewer people, kids dying unnecessarily, and a lot fewer parents suffering that misery. Another way to demonstrate the importance of behavior change. This is a big program in Bangladesh. I can't exactly translate, but the bottom line is, if you come to our village, don't shit in our fields. And VERC is a social enterprise that basically goes around telling people, offering these signs and saying, and you understand the reason why, right? If you shit in the fields and then you grow the plants, you're eating the shit. Yeah, okay. Communities sort of without subsidy, when that message is presented in a clear enough way, build their own latrines and put up these signs, and diarrhea rates go down, and that means the number of kids dying goes down. And it's not just about health. 50 years ago, in a large part of the world, it was not the norm to send your kids to school. You did it if you'd gone to school, or if you happened to be particularly keen. In particular, it was not the norm to send your girls to school. Why would you do that? It makes them less attractive marriage prospects. I am happy to say that attitude is pretty much gone planet-wide. And there aren't very many shining lights of what's happened over the last 10 years in Afghanistan, frankly. But one of them is what happened when schools were allowed to admit girls. There was a rush for the doors. Millions of girls turning up to school in Afghanistan. It has now become the norm in every country in the world that of course you send your children to school. That was not true 50 years ago. And it's become the norm. This is Eleanor Roosevelt with a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's become the norm worldwide that you should get to vote for whoever it is who's leading you. Now, I'm not saying democracy has spread worldwide, but even in countries where there's not democracy, if you go out and survey people and say, should you be voting for your president, they say yes. 80% and up worldwide say yes. Again, not only is not everywhere a democracy, many places are far from perfect democracies and with a full guarantee of all civil and political rights. But that norm is there. And over time, that norm is turning into a reality. So, I'm just hugely happy about what has happened in the past, but, there is the glass half empty. There's still a long way to go. And I don't mean to suggest there isn't. I do think there's a lot of life left in these trends yet to allow for improvement. The fact is, over the last few years, we've got new technologies, including the rollout of the mobile phone, but also pneumococcal vaccines, which are going to massively reduce the death rate from influenza. We've got new ways of making sure that kids aren't only in school, but they're learning stuff. Including again communications technologies, but also really simple stuff like subtitling TV programs in the language that's being spoken on the TV. Same language subtitling. It has a huge effect on literacy rates. So we've got all of these new ways on the technology side to increase, to continue to progress. And I think also on the demand side too, the spread of TV not least, the Arab Spring was called the Facebook revolutions for a reason. It wasn't the only cause, but it was a factor. So I think there's all sorts of optimism to think that the demand for development and changes in norms will continue happening as well, which means we can continue making progress. We do have to deal with our environmental challenges. I don't deny that. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but please, that is a challenge we need to overcome quickly if we are to continue seeing progress. But I think we can actually manage that too. So, back to it. I'd like to see a lot more lights in the African continent at night. I think we need to be careful when we judge people for wanting more money, not to judge the people who are living on $1.25 a day, not to judge the people living on $2 a day. Those people are facing hideous choices about how to spend money. Even though I'd rather live on $1.25 today than $1.25 20 years ago, living on $1.25 a day still quite often leads you saying, do I use the money to send my oldest child to the doctor to get an antibiotic, or do I use it to make sure my middle child gets decent nutrition so that they can developmentally and go off to school and actually learn something? Or do I spend it on sending my youngest kid to a school where she'll actually learn something? They face hideous trade-offs every day. $1.25 is not enough to live on. And the top 600 million people in the world, that's us lot, and another 599,999,999,000, blah, blah, blah. The top 600 million people in the world have an income 100 times the income of the bottom 600 million people in the world. If there is overconsumption going on, it's not the bottom 600 million, it's us. And if you're worried about global environmental sustainability, it's not the people who are consuming 1% of what we are that are the problem, it's us. And so don't put environmental sustainability on the backs of the poor. That, I do beg of you. But sort of the good news for the global environment and the planet as a whole is that because we are seeing better quality of life at ever lower incomes, it does suggest that really high incomes aren't required for a good quality of life. It kind of follows, doesn't it? There was a time when earning more than $5,000 a year really mattered to outcomes like education, to outcomes like health. If you earned over $5,000 a year, you were going to live a lot longer than people who were earning less than that. You were far more likely to be literate, and so on and so forth. Those relationships are not slowly, but pretty rapidly breaking down. So a basic quality of life is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And that's good news because it means that not everybody needs to have an income of $60,000 worldwide or whatever in order to lead a good life. And frankly, at least in the way we create income nowadays, if everybody on the planet did have an income of $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year, we'd be fried. So I think that is good news. But it also says what matters isn't more stuff, it's better stuff. Back to the case of polio and the iron lung. Rather than the iron lung, a polio vaccine. The iron lung is a halfway solution to an existing problem. The polio vaccine stops the problem happening in the first place. The iron lung is a massive piece of machinery involving serious industrial effort. The polio vaccine is a little thing that big that takes a needle. It's moving from big bad stuff to little good stuff that has been the real force behind the improvement of quality of life worldwide. And I think it says that you don't need excess, or you don't even need what we have in order to make for a decent life. And with that, I hope pretty soon we get to go off and have excess out there and eat and drink and make merry. But anyway, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Kenny.